we're going to do a preliminary exploration of what I sometimes find a rather complex topic of namespaces and how they relate to functions. And a related question to touch on briefly is the whole idea of why have modules. So in Python, we have, without having to do anything special like import a packet, a module like math, we have functions like print, length, that we can use as soon as we start Python. Whereas others, like the square root or random, we have to import a package and then access that function through that package, usually through the dot notation that we've been doing, like math dot square root or random dot random. The reason we have these modules is it allows us to, I guess, kind of 2 points. One, keep the namespace of the default Python pretty small. The number of names that are defined, like print and length, are things that are generally useful for all applications. Whereas a lot of times a program may never need to compute the square root. And so we can have that set aside in the math module, and programs that need it can access it by importing, my analogy of checking out from the library, those functions and the name and what we would refer to as the name of that function is the square root through the modules. This gives us a certain amount of flexibility. So we can have within Python a name square root that means square root as defined on the real numbers. And we can also have a name square root that is a function that's defined on the complex numbers. And we do that by putting them in different modules. In the first case, the math module, and in the second case, the C math module. So it gives us a great amount of flexibility without having what would be referred to as name collisions, where we try to have two names, same names, but referring to two different objects. Name collisions end up resulting in what we would refer to as hiding. So I'm going to illustrate this with creating a scenario where we're hiding a function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define my own function length, len, and have it have a different functionality than Python's length. So if you recall, if I take Python length and I pass it a string or a sequence or a collection, it will return how many elements are in that sequence or collection, in this case 5 letters in the name Brian. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define this new function, which is basically returning the square, assuming that we have an integer coming in. So if I run this, I'm getting this type error because in the context of a string, this syntax of n times n has no meaning within Python. However, if I invoke my new length function with an integer, it behaves perfectly well, returning the square of 9. I've now lost my length function in my namespace because this new function that I've defined is hiding the Python function len. If I want to get it back, what I would have to do is restart my kernel. Once I've restarted my kernel and I come back up here, I now have my length function, the Python length function back. And now if I do this, I get a type error now because an integer has no concept of length associated with it. Okay, so let's talk about scope. I have a link here to a online tutorial that's addressing namespaces. And we can think of names in terms of local and global scope. So local names hide global names. And I'll have an illustration of that in a second. And kind of related to this are the names of variables and functions have no relationship to when I'm calling the function. So they're different namespaces. We can see what names, such as variables that we've defined, are in the local namespace with the locals function, and I have a link here to the Python documentation. And similarly, we can see what names are in the global namespace with the globals function, and again, here's a link to that. If I open up, I haven't done too much with this yet, but if I do globals, you see IPython has a lot of variables that it's using behind the scenes. And so it has a global variable in that's a list of all the input that's gone into a cell, and then output. See, this is all really quite complex, and these are, for the most part, variables that are specific to the IPython notebook and the IPython shell that's running behind it. Let's look at it in a little cleaner setting. So here I have, in this cell, I'm defining a variable c equals 10, and that c sits outside of these function definitions that I have here. So I have function 1, and I have main. Now in function 1, I'm taking a number, and I'm going to create a variable b within function 1 and assign it equal to a number. And I'm just going to print out some values, and I'm going to ask what the local variable names are with the locals function. And then, because globals is so complex, I'm doing a little cleaner thing. I'm just asking, is the name c in globals, and if it is, what's its value? Here in main, I define another variable c equals 4, and I'm just going to print what c is equal to, and I'm going to have various invocations of the function 1. So in this case, I'm calling function 1 with the integer literal 5. In this case, I'm calling it with the variable c that I've created, and then I'm going to look at what the local variables in main are. So let's evaluate the cell and see what happens. So first off, I'm calling function 1 with the literal value 5. So when I come up here, I get b equals to 5, and then let's see what the value of c is. Well, c is 10, and that's because the function is seeing this global value c that was defined outside of itself. So in this case, c is a global variable. And when I ask if c is in my dictionary of global variables, I get the global value of c is 10. When I look at the local variables that are defined for function 1, I see that I have a variable named a number, which has a value of b, and a variable b, which has a value of 5. And then I'm returning 1, which is the value that's returned by the function. I come down here to the next kind of set of statements. So now I've defined a variable c that's equal to 4. I print what the value is. So here, c is equal to 4. It's not equal to 10 as it was up here in function 1, because the local name c is hiding the global name c there of 10. So when I call function 1 with c, the value 4 is passed, and I see that my b equals 4, but the c that is seen up here in function 1 is still the global value, and so c is getting printed out as the value 10. Kind of, just continuing on with that with another example of calling with 4. And then if I look at what the local variables are that are available in main, we have 1, and that local variable's name is c, and it has a value 4. We created a function b in function 1, so if we ask what its value is, we get a name error because b is not defined in the scope of this cell. B was only defined in the scope, the namespace of function 1, and it doesn't exist outside of function 1. In fact, I think that if I'm smart, I should be able to ask if globals, if I ask, is the variable b in globals, I've got to comment that out, false. So b was created in this namespace, and it exists only in the namespace of function 1. Okay, just some more illustration of this. Let's see. Skip that one. So I have function 3, and it takes a number and returns 3 times that number. So here I see I have a variable a, and I said a equals, let's just do this. Let's create a new variable, and we'll return d. Split the cell, and I create a variable b here. I call function 3 with that value b, and it returns to c, and c has the value of 15, which is 5 times 3. B remains unmodified, but if I go to print what the value of a is, I get a name error. A is not defined because a is only defined within this function 3. It's not defined outside of that, like where we invoked it from. And similarly, the name d is not defined because d only exists in function 3. And so this is just kind of the same point, that the variable names in the function definition do not correspond to the variable names when the function is called. So while I have a function here, d, when I call function 4, I don't have to have anything named d. And in fact, I'm going to get a name error again if I try to evoke that.